All right, so we have Mike Millian, President of the Private Motor Truck Council of Canada. So thank you for joining us. But first, I guess we'll start off. I really want to get to know you as a person and what the Private Motor Truck Council of Canada stands for and how long you've been the president there for.
Yeah, perfect. So, well, thanks for having me here today, Ronan. Myself, personally, I've been in the trucking industry for 34 years now, coming up on 35 years, I guess, in February. I started out as a driver first in the industry. I grew up in a beef farm in southwestern Ontario, and came off the farm at 18 when my dad sold it, and worked for a local livestock hauler for the first 3 years, hauling cattle and pigs and agriculture products. Then went into long haul for a refrigerated and general freight carrier. Ran 48 states and 6 provinces.
So you were actually a driver?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, ran long haul for, like I said, 5 years, 6 years, 48 states, 6 provinces. The truck driving school at the time then decided to open their own driving school, and I come off the road and was their first driver trainer at the age of 26, I guess. I was teaching other people how to drive truck. Did that for a couple years. Shattered most of my nerves trying to teach people that had never been in a truck before. And then I went into safety and compliance, mainly just because the school moved 2 hours away from where I lived. I did that for a couple years, and that was for a for-hire carrier up until that point. And then I moved into the private fleet industry, and I spent 12 and a half years as safety compliance training and maintenance manager for a company called the Counsel District Cooperative, which was an agriculture cooperative. Did that for 12 and a half years. While I was with Counsel, I got introduced to the Private Motor Truck Council at one of their conferences.
So it already existed?
Yes, yeah, it's been around since 1977.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so, but I got introduced because at a conference, and we actually applied for their Private Fleet Safety Awards, and the company I worked for, Counsel, won the safest large private fleet in Canada. Got involved with the association more. Volunteered to be on their board of directors. And then in 2015, their president announced, well, actually in 2014, their president announced he was going to retire. They did a search. Then the people on the executive committee thought I should apply. Took my wife a little while to talk me into it. Not because it wasn't...
Talk you into it? Usually wives talk you out of it.
Yeah, well, it's not because I wasn't interested. I was, but at the age I was, and we had young kids, and I was heavily involved in coaching their baseball, their hockey, and job ahead was 15 minutes away. This was going to be 2 hours away, so how do we make that work? And she said, you've wanted the job before, it may not be available when you want it next, so take it, we'll figure the rest out. Nice. And I applied, I got it. And
what year was that in?
I started in January of 2015, so it'll be 10 years next month.
Okay, and what have you seen?
Well, a lot. Like you said, the PMTC, like you said, we've been around since '77, and we're a national association who mainly represents private and dedicated fleets. In saying that, about 10% of our membership is for hire carriers as well, who have decided to join our association because not all of them, I think a lot of the issues, whether you're private or for hire, are the same. Safety and compliance out on the roadways, doesn't matter who you're driving for, you're all dealing with the same issues.
So for the audience that don't know what private fleets are, can you just give us a little bit about what is a private fleet and what makes it different than a company like ED Transport or just a motor carrier? For
sure. So what I tell everybody is, a for hire trucking company, for the most part, their only business is trucking. They will hire anything for anybody for money. So you get a product to move, you reach out to a for hire fleet and ask them if they can move it for you. They give you a quote, and if you like it, you pay them and they move your product. A private fleet is in trucking by default. So their main business isn't trucking, but they have a fleet of trucks to get their product or service to their customers. So examples that people would recognize, Loblaws, Home Hardware, Walmart. You don't think of those as trucking companies because that's not their main business, but they have a large fleet of trucks that they use to get their product or service to their end users. And most of those private fleets also contract for hire or dedicated carriers as well to do some other parts of their business. They may use their own fleet to get the stuff from the distribution warehouse to their store, but they'll use a for hire carrier or a dedicated carrier to bring the product or raw products into distribution warehouse. A lot of them also have manufacturing facilities, et cetera. Ontario Hydro, if you're Hydro One, I guess we call it now, that's a private fleet.
So at what point would a manufacturing plant consider to get their own assets or to start trucking?
Yeah, well, and I think it all depends on the business case, how big they become.
So do you see that when freight rates go up significantly, that's when a lot of manufacturers are starting to stumble on that, or?
Yeah, well, and a lot of it can depend on the independent business model too, and changes of ownership. They could go the other way too. They could have a fleet and then decide that these costs are too high for them, and they want to relieve themselves of the burden of that capital outlay and focus on their core business, and then hire somebody to do it outsourced.
And you've seen that happen?
Oh yeah, we've seen Kraft in the U.S. completely got rid of their private fleet about 4 or 5 years ago.
Wow.
Right, but one cost, you said, when you have a driver shortage, it can become difficult. But then we saw during COVID, when freight rates went through the roof, and you had a hard time finding anybody to move your freight. Private fleets, like everybody else, was having trouble getting their product moved, and were kind of at the beck and call of what anybody wanted to charge if you could get somebody to move it. So what we've seen since COVID, because during COVID you couldn't get drivers and you couldn't get trucks. Like even if you wanted to get drivers, you couldn't get trucks.
And private fleets also had a problem with getting trucks? Like with new ones, with what order?
Yeah, I mean, if the manufacturer's got an 18-month backlog, they've got an 18-month backlog, right? Like you can't just walk in and order it from them if they don't have it there for you to take. So since COVID, we've seen a bit of a relief of that.
So I just want to touch on that. So the 3 biggest struggles you would say for a private fleet in 2024, what were they? Would you say the hardest challenges of 2024?
Yeah, so we do our benchmarking survey that our fleets complete once a year.
Uh-huh.
And the number one challenge that our private fleet members associated with 76% of them said was obtaining qualified drivers. This is down from 94% the year before. But the key thing...
It's not obtaining drivers, it's qualified drivers.
There is... in my opinion, there's not a driver shortage right now.
Oh, I agree with you with that.
There might have been during COVID. There is an abundance of people out there with a license in their hand, looking for work that can't find work. Or in some cases aren't qualified to work, but unfortunately still do find work and get with a company that doesn't want to train them. So the number one issue is qualified drivers. I would say up until COVID, private fleets had a waiting list of drivers that they wanted to hire. When I used to work at the Hensel Co-op, we never ran advertisements. I had a stack of applications. I might ask one quit, pulled up another one and called them.
Word of mouth and...
Yeah, and mainly because drivers were home every night, pension plans, paid by the hour, all that sort of stuff, because it's not long haul over the road, which is where your biggest turnover is the long haul, right? Turnover is what leads to the driver shortage, really. If most long-haul carriers have a turnover rate in excess of 90%. Well, if you lose 9 out of every 10, you're never going to get rid of your driver shortage.
Correct. No, for sure. I mean, I truly believe we have a retention problem, not a driver shortage problem. I think the industry has gotten for the worst over the last 15 years.
Depending on the segment, what I will say is, again, we have our own benchmarking survey, and the turnover rate among the private fleet members that completed our survey was 12.7%.
Turnover, oh, so that's not bad at all.
And that's the worst turnover rate we've seen in about 5 years. Last year it was 9.6. So it has gone up. 12.7 still low, but when you're seeing it going up from 9, it's still something to pay attention to, right?
So biggest challenge, qualified drivers. Second biggest challenge is the 12, which is still pretty good, but the turnover. And then what else would you pinpoint that?
Before I move off of that, if I can, what we're seeing with it is in a lot of cases the turnover isn't because they're not happy there. Over half of that turnover was uncontrollable turnover. It was retirement, medical reasons, or death.
Wow.
Right. So I think that's why the turnover rate was getting higher. The average age of our driver keeps getting higher and leads to retirements or medically unqualified to drive. And I'd say the third, to get to the outland, I think this is the same whether you're for hire or private, is the cost of equipment. And new technology. So I put it as cost of inputs, which would be equipment, fuel, insurance, and labor.
Now, do private fleets also get into a captive, or are they on the traditional open market?
Some private fleets get into captives too. Like the fleet that I was running safety and compliance on before I came into the job at Private Motor Truck Counsel, we had a captive. We had a captive with 7 or 8 other private fleet members. It started out as a captive for the real estate, and then moved into the fleet end. And actually, I was the first chairperson of that captive.
Oh, wow,
Back
nice.
in 2012 or 2013.
Projection on cost of equipment, is that starting to go down, or are we complaining, or private?
It's not going to go down.
It's not going down.
No, because bottom line, even without looking at zero emission vehicle mandates and stuff that may or may not change with our buddy Trump south of the border there. What isn't going away is, even if those go away, the new diesel engines that are already in the works to come out in 26, 27 already have more strict emissions guidelines on them, which a lot of the engine manufacturers are claiming this is going to add another $30,000 to $40,000 to the cost of a truck by 2027.
Wow. So are we looking at the same thing that happened back in 12, 13 when the emission regulations came out, and then we had the DPFs and the EGRs, the filters that...
We hope not. I mean, the costs are going to be the same. I think we hope we don't run into the same mechanical failures that we ran into then. Where
those years were a nightmare.
Yeah, it was 07 and 012. I think 07 was bad with all the failures from the DPF, and then we went into SCR, which helped a little bit. But they all put the costs up, and hopefully this time they don't reduce the fuel economy, because we had a double whammy the first time where the cost of the equipment went up and the amount of fuel you were burning also went up at the same time.
Okay, well, hopefully the cost of equipment will stay the same. I have seen that the cost of the trucks and trailers, because of the economy, they are starting to give bigger discounts right now for them. There is no pileup or lineup of people waiting to buy trucks right now, which is great.
I do think that's going to change though, just because you're going to see, if you want to buy a truck that's pre-emissions before the next round, you need to be ordering within the next 6 months, because you don't order a truck and get it the next week. And I think a lot of people, the pre-buy was expected to be started already, but I think because of the state of the economy, people can't pre-buy even if they want to. But I think as we get into the first quarter and first half of next year, you're going to see people start to do more pre-buys to try and get ahead of the new emissions costs.
The rules are coming in 2026?
Model year 2027.
Model year 2027, okay, got it. When we were at the panel together, you had talked, there was a few topics that you mentioned that were extremely, I feel like the audience would love some enlightenment on. We had touched on enforcement and rules. Mm-hmm. Okay, so I know you had a lot to speak about that, but I want to choose particular topics and ask you about your opinion. So first of all, the trucking schools. Yep. The enforcement, lack of enforcement. You had touched upon that, but I don't think we had the time that we needed in order to really talk about it. What's your opinion about the trucking schools over the last, I would say, maybe 20 years? How they've gotten, the licenses. Every second person has the ability to be a truck examiner and a licensed school. What is it called? There's an actual term for it.
Well, mandatory entry-level training, but you have to be MELT certified.
MELT certified, and I think the license that they have is...
well, they're licensed by the MCU, Minister
Correct.
of Colleges and Universities.
That's right. So what's happening with the oversight over there? How has it gotten over the last 20 years?
Yeah, well, I mean, and we don't even have to go back as far as 20 years. So mandatory entry-level training, or MELT, came into place in Ontario. Was the first jurisdiction to have mandatory entry-level training, and it took effect on July 1st of 2017. It was one of the first files that I got involved in on behalf of the PMTC. We were one of the original stakeholders that sat together with the Ministry of Transportation for over 2 years, building and working on the mandatory entry-level training guidelines. So I have a pretty in-depth knowledge of it, and Ontario was the first jurisdiction in Canada. Prior to mandatory entry-level training coming in, So you could hop in the truck with Uncle Joe. As long as he had a Class A and you had a Class G, no rules, he could drive around the block, teach you how to drive, and then you could go to the drive test center and challenge for your road test, and away you go. So that's why MELT was brought in, because you didn't have to be licensed to teach truck driver training in this province. There was schools out there selling courses for $500 and $600, which was basically a 10-hour course where they drove you around the road test course over and over and over again until you could pass it, you got your license, and then we sent you out on the highway. So MELT was brought in to get rid of what we called licensing mills, put some rules and regulations around it, try and get those trucking schools out of the business. They settled on 103.5 hours of mandatory entry-level training. Why 103.5, I'm not sure. But that's what they got everybody to settle on. 32 of it is on the road. The rest is in classroom, behind the wheel, backing in the yard theory, basically.
So 103 hours, I know nothing about trunking. Within 103 hours, I can get licensed.
Yes. If you pass, yeah, it's supposed to be, the way it's supposed to be, it's a minimum hour based. Mm-hmm. So those are the minimum hours you would have to take, but you still have to meet the criteria. So schools are actually supposed to acknowledge or indicate that you have passed the competencies. If you've passed the competencies, then they enter you on what they call a KPI system in the province of Ontario. That now allows you to book a road test. So the minimum hours are 103.5, but you're also supposed to be competent. Most schools don't bother putting in whether you're competent or not. Finish the hours, away you go. Good schools will put in you're competent and assign extra training if you're not.
Would you say that there's a way that I could do it without doing the 103 hours?
Oh yeah, unfortunately.
There is.
Yeah,
I mean, we've seen just recently in the news that a couple of truck driving schools got busted for. What does an actual school? How much does MELT program actually cost approximately?
If you were to
Ontario.
teach the 103.5 hours and teach everything that you're supposed to teach, you're looking anywhere between $8,000 to $10,000. There's a whole bunch of truck driving schools out there advertising for $3,000 or $3,500. If they were teaching what they're supposed to teach, there's no way they're making money, right? And the reason we're running into this, so again, MELT was brought in it wasn't brought in as a bar. It was brought in to raise the floor, right? To put a minimum standard in place, which we did not have before. There was already schools out there before MELT was brought in through an association called Truck Training Schools Association of Ontario. Anybody that was part of that association had to teach a 200-hour school, had to teach a 200-hour program. But you weren't required to take a training program. So this was brought in to raise the floor.
So since 2017 until today, has there been any additional hours to the minimum requirements?
Not in Ontario. There's different rules across the country. Every province has different regulations. Some don't have it yet. Nova Scotia doesn't have mandatory entry-level training yet. Quebec doesn't. Rest of the country does, but it varies as to what the hours are. The highest hours in Canada or in British Columbia, they require 144 hours of training. Most of the ones across the West require 121. And some other ones are just at the 103.5. But 103.5 is the minimum that was set through the National Safety Code, which is a standard that all the jurisdictions agree that is a minimum that they will follow when they implement mandatory entry-level training.
So if we had a magic wand and we would be able to make rules, what rules can we put in place to make the road safer and to tighten up on licensing?
Well, first of all, you go back to MELT. We don't need any more rules. We need people to enforce the rules, right? Because the issue is we got 103.5 hours. We can argue about whether that's enough or isn't enough. Bottom line is it's more than what was required before the rules got brought into place. The issue is we have nobody enforcing the rules and regulations. We have schools that have to apply to say they are approved to teach MELT. They have to have a curriculum approved. They have to have proper buildings, facilities, equipment. And somebody's supposed to check on that. Nobody's checking on it. They're doing paperwork. There's 8 inspectors in all of Ontario to inspect over 280 truck driving schools, plus an additional 300 and some public career colleges that teach other programs.
That was the word that I was looking for, the public career college.
So there's 8 inspectors for about 600 public career colleges, and most of them would not know a fifth wheel from a Ferris wheel. So if they go check a truck driving school, they don't know what they're looking at anyway. So we need more resources, and we need more expertise to go in and check them. Right now it's just a paper shuffle. There's just papers being shuffled back and forth, and most of it's done virtually or online. Nobody's going on site and visiting these places.
Do you foresee anything changing in our industry when it comes to the trucking schools?
Not without enforcement, right? They're putting more rules and regulations in place. If you have a company that doesn't follow the first rule, what makes you think they're going to follow the second rule? You can keep stacking as many regulations on top of each other as you want. If somebody doesn't want to follow them, they're not going to follow them. And the only way you're going to make them follow them is to put enough enforcement and oversight in place that there's a fear of getting caught, and the penalties for getting caught are strict enough to take away the reward to cheat.
You heard about the closure or the soon closing of the Humber College?
Yep.
I think they've been in business for...
It's a long time. They were around long before Melt.
And what would you say the biggest reason probably of why they're shutting down?
Well, I'm not inside their books, so I don't know how their system was run. I don't know how they were managing it, what their management is. So there could be a number of different reasons. So I don't want to speculate as to why. But what I would say is it's hard for any legitimate school to compete when they're competing against those who are cheating and not bearing the full costs of what should be involved in properly training somebody. So I'm sure that is a factor.
So I feel like that happens in a lot of our industry, whether it's the truck driving schools or the trucking companies that follow rules of not misclassifying the drivers. I feel like the companies that are doing it the right way have a huge disadvantage, and the companies that are doing it the wrong way are getting away with it, and there is no enforcement. So how can we tackle that? How do we...
Well, again, the governments have to get serious about putting enough resources in place to enforce the rules and regulations. And from the trucking end, there's a number of them. The misclassification that you started with. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's, from a tax perspective, that's a federal government responsibility. In Ontario, you can also use WSIB and the other things to get at it and see what they're doing. Mm-hmm. Insurance companies play a role in this as well, because they can be vetting to make sure that they're running systems properly. I mean, the thing is, people don't generally break one rule, right? So if a carrier is misclassifying their drivers, mm-hmm. they're doing it to save on their tax obligations, which is costing us, the tax revenue that we need for our roads, our hospitals, everything that we take for granted in this country. In most cases, they are also selling it to their drivers as a perk, because you can make more than other drivers. What they're actually doing is taking advantage and abusing those drivers as well, because what most of those drivers don't realize when they start, but they find out a year, 2 or 3 years into it, you're not paying as much tax right now. Hopefully they're filing their taxes and still paying the taxes they're supposed to. But if the economy takes a downturn, which we're in right now, and your company that you're working for lays you off, you've got no unemployment. You've got no disability. You have no protections that somebody else has that is paying unemployment insurance through their payroll deductions. You don't get disability through your payroll deductions because you're not being taxed properly. A lot of them aren't buying their own disability insurance because they don't know they have to. They don't. So these company owners are not only robbing us of tax revenue, they're also basically robbing their own workers of their employment rights that they're guaranteed in this country.
So if the Canadian government is losing so much money from this, why haven't they been able to crack down on it? I don't see any enforcement around this.
Not very much.
I've been hearing about it. I think my first video that I did about it was 4 years ago. And I thought, I read the articles and I saw WSIB was getting involved, and I saw, a couple of articles of a few companies being busted, but they weren't really busted for that. They were busted for not paying their WSIB portion.
Yeah.
And then I talked to actually a couple of officers, and blank out. They said there's absolutely nothing that we can do about it. So why do you think that we haven't been able to crack down on it? I mean, I'm a member of the Ontario Trucking Association. I see that it's on the agenda, and we talk about it. They talk about it quite often, but it's year after year after year after year that we're talking about the same things, but nobody's able to crack down on it. And if you ask me, I mean, I feel like it's a pretty simple thing to crack down on.
Yeah, and again, it comes down, I mean, not putting the resources in place to enforce it in the first place. And
do you think our current laws are in place in order to crack down on it?
I think for the most part, yeah.
For the most part.
I mean, we talk about misclassification of drivers. This isn't just a trucking industry issue. This is
in the construction, and there's a lot of
It's in many different industries.
Correct.
Right. And they need to put more people in place, and they need to change the laws a little bit to increase the penalties, I would say. So even if you do catch them, the fine cannot be less than what they should have been paying in taxes in the first place. Right. And there's a whole bunch of other protections we can put in place around this too. It's not only just enforcing the CRA rules, but if you look at the fact that, like I said, most companies will not break just one set of rules. So if they're going to break this rule, they're going to break a whole bunch of other rules. They're not likely keeping their equipment up to date like other carriers should. They're not likely training their drivers properly. They're not likely vetting their drivers properly. There's a whole segment out there who are performing fraud in their insurance, basically. They're going through carriers that have unsafe safety records, have a hard time getting insurance the traditional way, so they go through facility insurance.
Yes.
Which is extremely cost burdensome. But the way they're getting around it is they don't report how many vehicles they have. So they may have 100 vehicles on the road, they report they have 5.
But they still have an insurance certificate, and they're able to, to take loads from the load boards.
And they're not paying what they should be as an unsafe carrier because they're misrepresenting their fleet. You generally have insurance brokers that are helping them with this too, right? So there has to be an enforcement and crackdown from everybody, and we need to start enforcing road safety as well. If you put more officers out on the road, keep the weigh scales open 24/7 in certain, I know you can't keep every scale open 24/7, but increase the weigh scale enforcement as much as we can.
But do you think it's normal that I can't ask the driver as an officer what's their status here in Canada? Or that I can't, like, there's certain things that you're not allowed to ask, right?
Yeah, well, and I guess...
Or how you're getting paid? Can you show me your pay stubs? So an officer cannot just ask a driver, show me your pay stubs, or how
Well, I think it'd be pretty hard for a driver to produce a pay stub at the side of the road.
2 seconds, open your bank. Like, I mean, everything is digital these days, right?
Yeah.
But I just feel like the power has been taken away from our enforcement, that they can't really enforce. They don't have the tools to enforce.
Well, and I don't know that a roadside officer's ever enforced that, right? Like we're talking 2 different levels of enforcement here, right? Like, I think somebody that's enforcing roadside safety, you wouldn't expect a CRA auditor to go out and inspect your truck and trailer either. I think you have to separate those. Right. I understand what you're saying, but I think you have to separate the two a little bit. I think where we could look into it is not the roadside, but if the government is provincial, because that's who enforces road safety around here, if they're doing an internal audit on the company where they're checking all their safety and compliance records for their equipment, their drivers and everything, there's where I think you could get into asking for payroll records, because you can already ask for those on your hours of service anyway. Right. And then seeing if proper taxes are being deducted, and then if they're not, then report it uphill to the CRA or the proper auditor. So I do see a place for it on an internal audit. I don't think you can do it on roadside.
Yeah, so the roadside is the only place where you'd be able to track down a driver name and a unit number. Right? So then when there is an audit, then you know exactly which driver was in which truck. And then, like you said, you can ask for the payroll records of that driver. But you actually have to have people doing the the audits that know what they're doing, right? They have to know what they're looking for. So my question to you is if they ever put together a task force, would you participate in putting a task force
for sure.
for the crackdown?
Our association would, for sure.
For sure, yeah. Nice.
Yeah, because I think bottom line, I'm not sure all of us individually have the answers, but if we put a whole bunch of us in the room, maybe collectively we all come up with some different answers that are different tools as ways to get at it. But bottom line, we have to increase enforcement around these items, right?
Sure.
You could drive from, you could leave here, you could leave your offices here in the Toronto area and drive all the way out to Vancouver, and I'm pretty confident you would probably cross no more than 2 scales that would be open. And that's not right.
No.
And the first one might be when you hit the Manitoba border.
The next topic I want to talk about is the LMIAs and bringing foreigners as truck drivers. I have a feeling you know a lot about this.
Yeah.
How are the private fleets? Are they bringing foreigners here for their vacant positions to fulfill or?
Yeah, I would say yes, probably not as much as the for hire side was, just because we weren't, the private fleet industry, suffering from the shortage as much. But it has increased from what it was prior. What we're seeing in the private fleet industry, they didn't really have mentorship and finishing programs before COVID. Doesn't mean they didn't have orientation programs. They did. The drivers were brought in, they were taken through orientation, company paperwork, might ride with the driver for a day or two to learn the customers, but they didn't have to teach them any driving skills. Mainly private fleets used to hire people that had been driving for 10, 15, 20, 25 years, who'd been coming off the road from doing long haul and now kind of wanted to settle into a different role. What we're seeing now is private fleets will hire from schools now. They'll partner up with good schools, so we're not getting some of the bad ones I was talking about. And they will hire people with less experience than they used to. But what they're finding is the quality of these individuals they're hiring, and in some cases they're hiring drivers who have 2-3 years experience. And the quality of that driver is not where it should be for somebody who's been driving for 2 or 3 years. They still need finishing on their driving skills. So yes, they will hire from schools, they will hire foreign workers, they'll hire all the sources that they can when they need to fill the seats. And private fleets have been expanding their fleet since COVID to try and be more insular, I guess, for next time we hit a
pandemic
shortage. Well, hopefully we don't hit another pandemic, but I guess we never thought we'd hit the first. Well, I guess it wasn't the first one, it was the second one, but first one in my lifetime. Hopefully
it'll be the last one in my lifetime.
but yeah, they have more finishing programs now than they had before because they're having to finish these drivers on their driving skills. And that's not just, like I said, foreign workers, but it's.
Would you say the foreigners are vetted properly on the private fleets? Because in the, for fleets out there, I would say there's a lot of problem and a lot of fraud happening, especially with the foreigners. And there's been a lot of bust about charging outrageous fees for bringing them in.
From our end, I would say yes. Would I? I don't know any of my members that are abusing the temporary foreign worker system, the LMIA process. Can I sit here and tell you that 100% of my members are not involved in anything unseedy? I can't say that 100% for sure. I don't know what everybody does every minute of every day. But I would say for the most part, and from what I hear, they're the cream of the crop, the best of the best. But doesn't mean there isn't some that are out there using it. But getting to what you're talking about, yes, that's another tool that we need to crack down on, right? And that's communication between the feds and the provinces. We have agencies out there charging $50,000, $60,000 to bring temporary foreign workers in, selling them a path to permanent residency. They're not allowed to charge them $50,000 to $60,000.
And they're also not drivers from other countries, truck drivers. That's what I find. I get a lot of resumes and I get a lot of nonstop emails on foreigners because I've done so many videos on this, but
Yeah.
they're not qualified drivers. I mean, the whole point of temporary foreign, like to bring other drivers from other countries to fill in the seats, but a lot of people are just not bringing in drivers, they're bringing in money.
Yes, correct. And then in a lot of cases, they're affiliated with the school, who are one of the schools I'm talking about that aren't teaching training properly. And then they either have a relationship or are affiliated with a trucking company that they then put them to work for. And then all the money that they charged them, which they may not have up front, now they deduct from their wages and they're being paid less than what they should be getting paid, and our hands are tied and can't leave that company because they're trying to get a path to permanent residency, and the person holds all the cards.
Yeah, they're also, their LMIA is locked to a certain company, right? It's very hard to change it over to another company.
Now, if it's done properly and you didn't have a concern, though, you are supposed to have a complaint process and you can put a complaint in. But then in a lot of cases, the complaint doesn't make it to where it's supposed to, so they're scared to even put the complaint in, because then they figure, well, I'm just going to be sent back home. So unfortunately, it's not giving our industry a good name or our country a good name, because we're bringing people in and then they're being abused. And if they do get past, if they do happen to make it a year with a trucking company, get their fees paid off, and get free, I guess we'll say, they don't want to drive truck anymore because their introduction to the industry was so bad and so horrifying. They want to get out of the industry as quick as possible. So how does that solve our shortage problem? It doesn't. It's just leading to a churn again,
unless
right?
you're actually bringing in qualified truck drivers from other countries.
And they are working for a carrier that gives a shit.
For sure.
Right?
I've had experience. 2 years ago, I did an application to the LMIA, and I have to say that it is not regulated in any way, shape, or form. We got the approval. From the approval, we brought in 3 truck drivers, and nobody came to audit me. Nobody checked my safety score. Nobody checked that I have insurance on file. Nobody checked anything, and I was able to bring 3 drivers in here. And I thought, wow, if this was so simple for me, I can just imagine what goes on out there and who's bringing in what drivers.
Yeah, well, and there was a case, I want to say 2019, so we're going back a few years, but there was a carrier out of BC who'd been approved through the process, approved by the province and then approved by the feds.
Is that the carrier they found out that it works out of the basement?
I don't remember the name, but anyway, they were approved to use the program, bring temporary foreign workers in. Then they were found to be violating fair labor practices and not paying the minimum wages that they were supposed to. They were fined by the federal government over, I believe it was over 100,000, might have been over 200,000, because of paying too low wages. While they were in, this court case was happening, and they got a fine levied on them, they got approved to bring more temporary foreign workers in and hire them again. How's that happen? Right, because it was a lack of communication between the province and the federal government. But I mean, how can, once you get fined, you shouldn't have access to any temporary foreign workers again for at least a minimum of 5 years, as far as I'm concerned.
Oh, for sure, or it should be banned completely.
Yeah. So what we're promoting, us and other associations, and what we've put forward with the Canadian Council of Motor Transport Administrators, which is an association that works together with all the provinces, territories, and the federal government to try and get them to implement and follow same rules. They're the guardians of the National Safety Code standards. Yeah.
So just to touch on that, but I feel like sometimes Ontario would have one set of rules and another province would have a different set of rules, and it causes more problems than actually solves anything.
Well, it can, and that's what the CCMTA is supposed to be there for, is to get the provinces and territories to agree to a minimum set of standards that are enforced for federally regulated carriers. They agree to it, doesn't mean they have to put them in place right away, or they may put them in place and then make some amendments to them. But if you're a federally regulated carrier, it's supposed to be enforced the same for all. Provincially regulated, they generally all have a little bit of a different spin on it, but that's what the CCMTA is there for, is to try and get the jurisdictions and the feds to agree. Because the bottom line is, as far as road safety goes, the federal government has no enforcement arm, right? They rely on the provinces and territories to enforce their rules for them, right? But what we've proposed to them, along with other associations, is if you want access to temporary foreign workers, we understand we need temporary foreign workers. We want temporary foreign workers on a path to permanent residency. And bringing somebody in for 6 months and then having them go back is not really good for anybody as far as we're concerned. And with our licensing process, it doesn't work in the trucking industry anyway, right?
Correct.
Right, because they have to go through MELT, right?
I think 2 years they give, and then 3 years, 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, well, no, yeah, you've got the whole process, unless they've got an agreement. Some countries they have an agreement with where they'll do a license exchange or recognize the experience and equivalency, but you still have to go through MELT, right? Anyway, what we're promoting is you have any carrier that wants access to it, they're pre-approved. So before they have access to temporary foreign workers, they have to be vetted as if a carrier, the same as a carrier would be audited for road safety. And when you vet them, you're going to make sure that their CVOR in the case of Ontario, or your provincial safety rating in whatever other jurisdiction you're in, they're all going to be audited. You're going to make sure that they're a safe, compliant carrier. They would at least have to be satisfactory or above. You're also going to check them against their labor practices to make sure that they pay properly, they have no labor violations against them, they're paying minimum wages if they're supposed to, they have proper safety and compliance oversight in place. And we go a step farther too, is if you're going to bring them in, we also want to see that you have a program in place that helps integrate the workers that you're bringing in into your company and into your community.
So when you explain all this to me, this makes sense. Why is it that it's taking so long to implement these things? I mean, you're explaining to me, and I say, wow, you know what? Why would it be any different? I mean, it actually makes sense. You want to bring in a foreign worker, you need to get vetted properly. But why can't this change happen as fast as we would like it to?
Yeah, again, it comes down to the will of the people in the governments, provincial and federal, at the top, putting the resources towards it. To enforce these things, it all takes money, and it's whether you can get on their list enough to want to put the money in there. But I think some of this, to be honest, we've said there's so many different levels that have to be enforced, right? But I honestly think if you started enforcing road safety as well, a lot of the carriers that are not compliant with proper classifications and stuff would also be hit by this, because like I said, you don't break one rule. I don't know too many people that only break one, right? So there's a number of different areas we have to go at it to get at non-compliant and misclassified trucking companies.
Trucking companies right now are dealing with a lot of fraud in our industry. Double brokering, fraudulent, I would say, companies pretending like they're somebody else, giving you loads. Do you see fraud in private fleets also?
Well,
aside from like the phishing emails, or
yeah, and private fleets can see it from both sides. You have to remember, private fleets in a lot of cases are also manufacturers, are also shipping freight out. Like if I'm trying to think of an example here. But I mean, in a lot of cases, a private fleet is also manufacturing a product, and they don't put all that product on their own vehicles, so they could also be a shipper, right? So it's definitely in the private fleet as well. I might not be quite as bad as it is for the hire, because a lot of the for hire stuff is hit on load boards and stuff, right?
The fraud happens on load boards.
Yeah, whereas most private fleets aren't really using load boards all that much, right? Unless they're access. A lot of private fleets, manufacturers have their contract carriers that they're using, or they're, a dedicated carrier or a contract. But it's still out there for sure.
Okay. So the last topic I want to talk about is what do you think about the 25% tariffs? If that does happen, how do you think private fleets are going to get affected?
I think we're all going to get affected. If there's a 25% tariff that that Trump puts on across the board, which is what his initial threat was there a week or so ago, it's going to hit everybody. It's going to hit every Canadian. It's going to hit every American. And it's going to hit every business, private or for hire. It's going to increase the cost of our goods. Canada's going to have to counter tariff. If he puts 25% tariff on our stuff, Canada's got to do it back, right? Which is going to increase the cost of everything going both ways. It's going to increase the cost of equipment. It's going to keep.
Do you think he means it, or do you think it's just something he threw out just?
How would you ever know with him? I mean, to be blunt, how would you know? A couple days afterwards, he was already talking about exempting some products. They happen to be the products that he needs, that his country needs. Oil, raw minerals, lumber, which are three of the top exports that we send into the U.S. because they have a shortage of lumber to build their houses, rare minerals, aluminum, the tariffs that he put on there before. A lot of these tariffs are the top exports that, if they're put on, are going to affect the cost of living of their own country fairly heavily. So he's already had talk about exempting certain products. I'm not an economics major, that's not what my background is, but I mean, tariffs going back and forth generally increases world inflation, it doesn't lower it. And a tariff of this level would be catastrophic as to the costs, as we might see inflation levels like we were seeing a couple of years ago again. If you put a 25% tariff on everything across the board. I don't think we're going to see 25% across the board. I don't think it's realistic, but
who knows?
but if it is there, I mean, it's going to have severe effect on everybody.
Okay. I think that's it. I've covered pretty much everything I wanted to cover. Any comments, concerns, things that are on your mind that you might want to share with the audience? 2025, where do you see it? Do you think the same challenges that we had in 2024 are going to follow us into 2025?
I think we're going to start to see the economy and the rates start to turn around a little bit. I don't think it's going to be in the first half. I honestly think it's probably going to take to the second half of 2025, late second quarter, early third quarter, before we start to see much of a rebound in rates. I still think we need more trucking companies to go bankrupt and go out of business, because there's still too many out there bidding on too little freight. When some do go bankrupt, we need to not keep them afloat. We need to let them go. And so the other ones,
I feel the system is made in a way that it tries to keep everybody afloat for as long as possible.
Yeah, well, that's not necessarily a good system. We need to let people go that don't know how to run business or get too far in, so other ones can reap the benefits. Because bottom line, we saw the explosion during COVID of carriers. I was fine when there was lots of freight to move.
Yes.
But that bubble ended a year later, and now we still got more carriers than we had in 2019, moving less freight than we were moving in 2019. So we still need more to go, but I think it will spin. But again, I'm not an economist, but I feel we're probably another 6 to 9 months before we start to see much of a spin around.
Well, I'm happy about the fact that the interest rates are slowly coming down.
Yeah.
It's definitely easing the burden. It's going to ease the burden with cash flow for sure.
For sure. But no, I think we've covered most of it. We just, we gotta keep working with governments, keep pushing governments, and try to keep getting enforcement in place. And I think some of that enforcement industry needs to play a role in. Like 85% of carriers in Ontario are satisfactory unaudited. That means 85% of the fleets that are operating out there have never had anybody come in and audit their fleet. Government's never going to have enough resources to audit all of them. We as an industry, I feel, and I know others feel, would be in favor of an approved third-party audit system where the government oversees it, but third-party auditors are approved by the government, then they're hired by the trucking company pays for it. But if the audit's happening every 2 to 3 years and every trucking company is getting audited, it should weed out some of the bad players. And if everybody has to pay for the audit, it's a fair system. It's not a cost burden if everybody has to do it. And you'd pay on fleet size. Like somebody who has 1,000 trucks is not going to pay the same for an audit as somebody who has 2. It's going to take longer. So you'd have to figure out a scalable system. But I think
I'd be for it.
And I think there has to be some skin in the game for the trucking industry. We can't police ourselves. I hear people say we have to police ourselves. Nonsensical. You're never going to be able to police yourself. How are you going to police the bad actors when you don't have an enforcement tool behind you?
Correct.
Right. It's a wild, wild west if you say we're all going to police ourselves. But I think we have to pay and contribute towards policing our own industry. Whether that's paying for audits so we're all audited, helping supply the resources, moving to the point where we classify truck drivers as an apprenticeship model, a mandatory apprenticeship model, and a skilled trade. You're going to have to pay the drivers more, but if everybody who legitimate is paying it more, then the rates can also go up to go along with it. We have to legitimize it more, and we have to be willing to pay some of that freight and put our some skin in the game ourselves.
Yeah, well, listen, I agree for sure. I'd be the first one to to help you do it.
Well, I think the only ones that complain about not wanting to pay for an audit are the ones that know because it's going to cost them, because they're not following the rules.
Listen, we had the last audit we had was, I think it was 3 years ago, and I actually put some of it on YouTube. It was,
Okay.
We got 90-something%
Nice.
rate, and gave us it was really nice to put it up on and to show people the audit of how it works and how it how they ask you for the truck list, trailer list, and how they go over the logbooks. Today's digital world is very different.
Yeah.
Than an audit that I did probably I think it was maybe 9 years ago was the one that I had before that.
Yeah.
And it's very different, logbooks and papers, and
Yeah.
now it's like, okay, give me the USB stick, right, where they go in and they can see all the logbooks, and I feel it's a lot easier to catch fraud today.
I would hope so.
But an officer has to know what he's looking for or where to look for.
And they still have to come in on person and site to do
Yeah.
some. You can do some online, but you can't do it all online, because if you do it all online, it's also too easy for a person that knows how to game the system to use the same tools and cheat.
Yeah, for sure.
But-
I mean, listen,
but-
we've seen a lot of these ELD companies that get busted, or I don't know how in the world they let certain companies get into Canada and be a registered or
Yeah.
authorized ELD system, or in the U.S. I mean, it's just.
Well, in the U.S., it's just self-certification. Anybody can get in.
But
There's about 600 devices.
Yeah, but that's a problem.
Yeah.
It's a problem when you can call dispatch and you can tell them, and I've heard stories and comments all over the place about, what are you talking about? You can just call safety and they'll do whatever they need to do to edit your logbook, and ghost drivers. There's so many things that but it's all short-lived, I believe.
Well, and coming into Canada, at least, the ELD has to be certified by an independent third party. I mean, they have to pay to get it certified,
Mm-hmm.
which is one of the reasons there's a lot less certified devices here. However, and then it does have to get verified once a year, so I still do feel it's better than what the certification process is in the States. I think it's significantly better. But the issue is with technology, as you know, it could be certified today in the truck tomorrow, and then some wizard out there can figure out a way to hack it the next day and make it non-compliant, but it was just certified the other day. So there's always going to be, the easier it is to track things, the easier it is to cheat things. In some cases, right, unless the process is in place. But I just want to mention though, so you mentioned you've been through 2 audits.
Yeah.
So in my time in safety and compliance and as a driver, I went through 2 audits, one with a private fleet, one with a for hire fleet. You said you scored 90%. The private fleet I was with,
92, I think it was.
Yeah, we scored 89.
Oh, nice.
Okay, but you and I have both been through 2 audits in the time of our industry. 85% of the companies have never been audited. So what's that tell you? How many companies that used to get audited compared to now has gone way downhill?
The first time that I've gone through the audit, I passed, but it was a rude awakening.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah.
So I believe that it's actually a good experience, because
sure.
somebody needs to teach you also, okay, what you're doing wrong, what you're doing right, and what to improve on. And when you're getting slapped fines left, right, and center for things that you didn't do 100%.
Yeah.
And a perfect example is a safety 9 years ago, 10 years ago, if a safety would expire on the 23rd and you would do it on the, it would still be in the yard, nobody would be driving it, but if you did your safety on the 24th, well, the safety has to be done either on the day or the day before, or else you get penalized for it, right? They take away the points. But you don't know that, going into the industry, especially, I went in when I was 21, what did I know? Trial and error. But definitely the education, we can definitely do a lot better with educating.
For sure.
And I feel like that, an audit is, you learn a lot from an audit.
Yeah, for sure. And the MTO used to print a guidebook that told you exactly what they did on an audit. And when I was at the private fleet I was at, I took that guidebook and put our whole company through about an 8-day audit, just like I was an MTO officer, for the exact purpose. And I said, why are we doing this? And I said, well, I'd rather find out what our issues are before the MTO comes in, not wait. So let's find out now, because I'm not issuing any fines to our own company. And the MTO ended up coming in 2 years later, and the score that I gave us was significantly worse than the one the MTO gave us. I was way too strict, I guess. But
I feel like mock audits are huge right now.
Yeah.
They're huge for small carriers, larger carriers. I mean, it's definitely a thing out there, and I think it's safety and compliance experts that go in and do a mock audit on you, and it's
the CVR, the MTO just come up with 16 CVR learning modules that a new carrier has to take when they apply for a CVR now. It's a 7 to 12 hour process.
Oh, nice.
And then they're developing 2 additional ones, and one of the additional ones they're developing is the audit process, to walk carriers through what an audit looks like and everything.
This is great. I mean, I wish they had these tools when we started out.
Yeah. So now you still have to get people to watch them, but at least they're going to be there now, right? Which is a start towards your education. And I feel that's the role that a lot of associations play too. A lot of associations are there to help educate their members, keep them up to date on rules and regulations, find out what their pain points are, and help them with their voice with the government. But the issue is, most of the companies that need to be educated on rules and regulations don't belong to associations and don't look for it, because some don't know because they haven't learned. Some don't know because they don't want to.
It's the first time I'm part of an association.
Yeah.
Right. 18 years. What do I know? I know the four corners of my walls. That's it.
Yeah.
Right. But now it's like we're finally starting to get into these associations, because we want to be heard. We want to start driving change in our industry. We see how much we're suffering right now because certain things need to be cracked down on and tightened up the rules, for sure.
Yeah.
But it's been 18 years for us, and there's also a lot of other carriers, I'm sure, in the same boat. But if you made these modules that you're talking, if you make them mandatory to get your authorities, then people would actually watch them, because they would have to.
Well, you hope so. You hope the right people watch them, but it's a start anyway. Right? The education's there for those who want it. Then you have to try and make sure that the education is actually used for those who need it.
Well, thank you very much for coming out.
No problem. Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed it.
Yeah, it was good.
I enjoyed it myself. Definitely an eye-opening. Let's, if we can, drive change together. That's really. I'd love to be a part of it.
Sure. Perfect. All right. Thanks.
Thank you.